All right. What's up, guys? Welcome to another edition of Sunday Fun Day Controls Talk Edition. Today, we're going to talk about a matter that I think is very near and dear to many people's hearts, and that is the topic of environmental science and climate change. And we're going to see just how some of these highly noble ideas can actually be co opted for nefarious means, even though at face value they might have some very seemingly noble intentions. There's a very famous phrase, all things, something like all paths to hell are paved with good intentions. So I don't think this story really differs much from that, but let's go ahead and get right into it. Just as a disclaimer, as usual, all the opinions you're about to hear are my own. No one's paying me for this content, nor has anybody reviewed or approved what you're about to see prior to my stream. I'm not sponsored by anybody, and you're more than welcome to use any of this content as you wish. I will share the slide deck after the end of the stream. I'll post it to LinkedIn as a separate post, and I'll attach the link of that post on the YouTube live stream as well as the LinkedIn live stream. And I'll tweet about it as well so that you can get access to it. All right, so today we're going to talk about what it means to greenwash something and just what this fancy acronym that many have come across called ESG is. We're going to talk about why the Green New Deal and ESG have failed. I say this both as my opinion as well as something that you can read from many other scientists and journalists on really why, yet again, these seemingly positive and well-intentioned initiatives have more or less fallen flat on their face. We're going to talk about a expose I recently did at a place I worked as a solutions architect, and I'm going to help paint the overall picture for you, not just with this particular organization, but a more broader issue that, although they serve as a case study, life cycle in this case, they're really not all that unique from many others who are in this space right now or are trying to get into this whole sector of renewables, green technology, and so forth. We're going to talk about some brief calls to action on some other housekeeping items, and I'll get to any Q&A that I see on the chat on LinkedIn and YouTube. So without any further ado, what is greenwashing and ESG? So really, ESG, which stands for environmental, social governance, is a framework designed to be used primarily by investors in order to evaluate a organization's trustworthiness based on their compliance to each of these three pillars. The intention was to essentially breed a series of organizations, not necessarily just for-profit companies, but nonprofit organizations as well, and government agencies as well, to essentially implement, with the idea of implementing pro-social behavioral changes based on how their actions impact the physical climate as well as the community's well-being that they are operating in. The overarching theme here is the ultimate end goal is to reduce carbon footprint that these organizations have on planet Earth. So there you go. The problem I take with ESG is the two of the three factors are not only they're poorly designed, they're poorly it's very difficult to quantify them, and the one factor, environmental, that we can in fact very easily quantify and show just what sort of impact you're having is the quantity of electricity consumed, quantity of water consumed, similarly quantity of gas consumed, potentially the quantity of electricity you generate based off of some sort of renewable technology, say solar and wind that you might be generating. Those are really easy things to capture to show, okay, how efficient are you being in your use of water, electricity, gas, and so forth. But the other two criteria are really difficult to quantify. And ESG as a framework has really done very little to qualitatively and quantitatively provide guidelines, discrete guidelines that you can practically show that you're doing a good job, right? That you're actually in accordance. And not only that, but by you being in accordance, your outcomes are actually more positive, more pro-social. And by and large, that has yet to be proven to be the case. So, uh, greenwashing, on the other hand, is essentially when false claims are made about the environmental friendliness or sustainability of some product, service, your organization, or a practice that you engage in. The idea is really to portray this image of, that you really care about the environment, that you really are there to help people. But at the end of the day, there's no real action, measurable, concrete action that has legal weight that actually shows that you actually care, that you're actually living up to claims that you're stating. The biggest issue really out of these two that I take is none of them, nowhere in the ESG framework does it mention assuming fiduciary responsibility. For those of you that might not be in finance and accounting, really it means your end performance. You have a legal obligation to disperse profits to not only your shareholders, but to your stakeholders. So that could be with designating a certain amount of jobs have to go back to the community that you're operating in. It could be that a certain percentage of those funds have to be used for certain services like mental health services, social services to help with child rearing. So claiming the fiduciary responsibility is a very hefty legal weight that frankly would be very easy to just utilize in the ESG frameworks. And yet time and time again, regardless of the country and the organization that has adopted this branding of being ESG compliant, there is no mention of assuming fiduciary responsibility. Top that off with the fact that nowhere in this framework does it include whether the technology, research and development conducted by the organization and the results discovered and any artifacts therein have to be open source. None of the, there is no such policy or mandate in any of these ESG frameworks. And so I blend in ESG with this idea of greenwashing because really at the end of the day, there's nothing concretely to show that you're being more environmentally friendly. Sure, you can make a claim that a particular process you've optimized to use less resources in terms of electricity and water, but that doesn't mean that in some other process you now have to compensate by using more. And furthermore, in order to get that particular process optimized, you actually have to sacrifice a series of social on the social scale of the ESG framework, where you might have had to lay off 10, 20 people to achieve it. And those jobs are actually jobs supposed to be designated for the community, and you might not be forking over any, profits or revenue obtained from that value of reducing your consumption in one process. In the technology you utilize in order to optimize that process, if there's no mandate that you have to open source it so that somebody else operating in a similar vertical can take advantage of, so they too can be lean and optimized, then it's pointless. You might as well not have even made the discovery, and you might as well have just, taken it for what it is, patted yourself on the back that you've done something to aid your specific needs in your specific organization. But at the end of the day, you're not really doing anything with these discoveries, with these newfound knowledge, to help the rest of the public. And similarly, other organizations that are going through the same thing. So, um, fiduciary responsibility and a mandate of open sourcing the technology and discoveries, as well as technologies used in those discoveries, are absolutely key if this whole ESG framework is ever intent on succeeding. And right now, it's very clear with their pattern behavior that it's just not something in their purview. So, why the Green New Deal and ESG have failed. So we talked a little bit about what ESG is, what greenwashing is. We just talked about the fact that nowhere in the ESG framework does it mention anything about assuming fiduciary responsibility. Nowhere does it mention open sourcing your discoveries and technologies used. Those two are important factors, but we're going to dive into a third one in this upcoming slide here, explain in greater detail just why really these legislation around green technology and the ESG framework have failed. So to take a couple of steps back, when I talk about green legislation, what is it that I'm specifically talking about? So we have a couple, and they're actually from every political party. So we have what's called the Green New Deal, which is sponsored by Progressive Democrats. We have the Clean Coal initiative sponsored by conservative Republicans. And we have the Build Back Better sponsored by President Joe Biden. And essentially, what these are aiming to do, I just saw a typo on my slide deck there. I'll correct that when I release it. But essentially, what they're aiming to do is they are trying to achieve the ESG ideal. And again, I remind you that the only measurable criteria we have on ESG is the reduction of carbon footprint. So we can measure, a reduction in electricity, a reduction in usage of gas, a reduction in usage of water. And we can also talk about the generation of electricity through renewables like solar and wind. But that's about all that you can truly measure. And to have a successful circular economy, which these pieces of legislation all assume is already in place, you have to have what's called the ability to measure everything. Okay, you have to measure the ability to log all of your inputs and outputs to any system. So it doesn't matter what sector of manufacturing you're in, you have to have the ability to measure everything that comes in and everything that comes out. And not only at a aggregate gross scale, but on a finite, discrete scale where you can make more contextualized decisions based off of data. And by and large, the vast majority of manufacturers and even other businesses, quite frankly, that are operating in sectors like financial technology, that are operating in pure, software development, selling software as a service solution, even they severely lack the ability to track all the inputs and outputs coming into their organization, how they're being dispersed, and not only to be able to see what those numbers are, but to have a very high degree of confidence in their integrity. Meaning, are these numbers even accurate? And is what we are claiming about decisions we're using based off of these numbers, can we actually make that claim, right? Talking about stats 101, quantitative versus qualitative analysis, completely different. So on its face, these policies fail because they assume that a circular economy exists, and it frankly does not. Are there process control systems out there? Yes. Are they interoperable? Hell no. Why is that? Because open source does not exist. And not only that, but open source fundamentally is being absolutely suppressed by big name OEMs, by systems integrators, conglomerates, by governments, and by nonprofit agencies, these so-called industry associations, who one would imagine are there to protect and serve the interest of uh, making automation more easily accessible for all. And yet, even they too are against the proliferation of open source. So, with all these factors clearly bent on eradicating open source, and the clear non-existence of the circular economy, the only thing these pieces of legislation will do is encourage very predatory practices on who can get the most amount of funding from this large pool and be the first in the market to claim that they are doing this so-called, digitally integrated business model, when in fact, even they too do not have it. Um, because there is no true digital infrastructure, and more importantly, because this digital infrastructure is not built on the backbone of open source through and through, end to end, then what we are left with are proprietary digital ecosystems operated by a special few interest groups, which are there to serve their interests and have really no incentive to serve yours, and no real incentive to allow everybody to earn from the fruits of all these folks' labor who have built these technologies that help integrate with each other, that help share data across with one another. It by and large does not exist. And it has nothing to do with a technological capability. It's not because there is no there's no trained workforce. It's not because people don't know how. It's actually a systemic problem where it's intentionally being suppressed, and the pockets of places that are doing this are doing it to serve themselves. And what we have here at the end of the day is ultimately a race to the bottom, right? It's essentially who can IPO first, rake in huge sums of investor dollars as well as grant money from these pieces of legislation based off of greenwashing claims. And what it leads to is businesses that essentially are forced to overextend and over leverage themselves, wherein VCs will come in, they'll short the organization, and they'll reap tons of benefits for themselves at the expense of, essentially defrauding investors in mass, right? And what this does, unfortunately, is it detracts from the legitimate science that is environmental science. And it absolutely erodes the public's trust in not only believing that climate change exists, in that the science of environmental science is legitimate, but that any initiatives to do anything for environmental well-being, the public will now begin to take very weary. They will now see it as yet another grift, and rightfully so. They will not have any faith that the initiative set forward to making this a reality and an accessibility for all, not just the organizations involved in building this infrastructure and building this technology. The public will just see this as yet another corrupt institution, and that does not have their interest or the environment's interest in mind. So really, that's ultimately where things stand, not only today, but will continue to stand if more and more people do not speak out about these highly corrupt practices. So I highly encourage people to really take a step back from all this. Forget the efficiencies of the current state of black silicon. Forget the efficiencies reaped from certain materials based off of used in certain environments, in their particular, bulks modulus and all this other material science data. Instead, focus on really basic fundamentals, right? Which is these pieces of legislation assume a circular economy exists, which it does not. There is no mandate on the organizations to assume a fiduciary responsibility or to the communities they operate in. And number three, there's no mention of open sourcing any of the technology built, the scientific discoveries made, and the data aggregated on how to best optimize a particular process. And what's going to happen is essentially you'll have people who are trying to really all do the same thing. They're all going to have more or less the same barriers, and they're just going to repeat a crap ton of work. Everybody's going to try to come up with the same exact process recipe on how to optimize a specific step in the process when somebody else already did it. But because of this fierce refusal to share and open source, they're just going to have to, wade through the waters and suffer needlessly to ultimately come to the same solution that somebody else already figured out. So, we have this background now of what ESG is, what greenwashing is. We talked about the assumptions made by the so-called green legislation. So, how does this relate to, battery recycling, which is just one pocket of this overall sliver? It's just one pocket of this overall stack of green technology and environmentally friendly slash sustainable businesses and other sort of material science sustainability type of initiatives. That's what we'll cover next. So as far as battery recycling goes, the idea is you can repurpose batteries in a one-to-one, where if you take one battery that's of size 5, if you shred it and you process it, ideally you can get that battery back to a size 5, and it works just as well. That doesn't, unfortunately, it doesn't quite line up with reality, and it's actually a lot grimmer than even I would like to believe, but that's ultimately the ideal of what battery recycling is. You have one battery, A, it's of capacity 5, you shred it down after it's spent, you catalyze it, you then package it again into a new battery that is of size 5, capability 5 again, and you're good to go. Sure, you spend some energy in the recycling, but the ideal is that through economies of scale, you would be able to achieve so-called recycling nirvana, where the cost it takes you to do the recycling is far less than the cost to mine new raw materials to create new batteries that will then, of course, inevitably at some point be spent. So that's the overall business model for battery recycling. Compared to many other renewables, honestly, it's very, very simple. So that's part of the draw for battery recycling of all the renewables you can engage in. Since there's already a huge demand from other markets, it would make sense that you sort of approach battery recycling in order to gain attraction from the public, as well as you would assume it's a relatively simple product. It's only one product. You're trying to, get just one product, which is this powder that can be compacted and repurposed to new batteries. So that's why recently a lot of battery recycling companies have come about, and unfortunately, not all of them have a very clean history, so to speak. So top down, there's essentially the following, right? You have some spent battery, and the assumption is that you can remove it from wherever it was living in, be it a car, simple phone, or maybe nowadays you'll see batteries on trains and other industrial equipment like scavengers to do some sort of hybrid diesel system. So the assumption is that you can take that first of all and remove it. So we'll take that as a given. And then second of all, once it's spent and you can no longer get life from it, you then will essentially ship it back to a factory that claims to be able to recycle it. One obstacle there is, even though during its life cycle, it's no longer able to be used, it doesn't necessarily mean that the entire charge from the battery is completely gone. And so there's a risk associated with transporting a assumed spent battery that very well can, say, due to some transportation issue, that an accident occurs, a puncture occurs, and now you might have a potential lithium battery fire on your hands. And if you're not familiar with with battery fires, they're highly, highly complicated to reduce. Unlike, I don't know, if if ICE engine catches fire, then you cannot really. It's much easier to put out an ICE fire than it is a battery fire. So now it's arrived safely. If you're a smart recycler, what you're going to do is you're going to try to test the battery before loading it onto your shredder to ensure that it's discharged. If you're unable to do so, then ideally you would have lines set up that you can safely discharge and shred, or part of the shredding process can potentially also serve as a discharge based on how you have your shredder set up. Essentially, you plop the battery down on the conveyor, it goes into a giant shredder, much like the videos you've probably seen on YouTube with people throwing down like basketballs, Coca-Cola cans and whatnot. Gets shredded, great. Now, ideally during that process, if the battery form factor fits. If not, then make a giant, bigger conveyor belt and a stronger shredder. That's another topic, I think, for, is it possible to actually shred some of these batteries based on how they're housed and manufactured from different OEMs? Unfortunately, not all of them are as easy to shred. Some are damn near impossible and are not worth the time, regardless of how much potential black mass, which is the really the gold, so to speak, which contains these precious metals that you would like to recoup so that you can repurpose into new batteries. A lot of times, some batteries, if they cannot be recycled, then they're essentially just scrap, right? That's another for the landfill. During the shredding process, hopefully there's no violent discharge where, again, you have a battery fire and it potentially, comes into contact with your process control systems and wreaks havoc on your production line. So we'll assume that doesn't happen. Essentially, now you have a giant collection tank. It's usually of an aqueous solution. Your metals, float, and your plastics float, and your black mass gets crumbled as a powder. It goes through a giant sieve. The water, obviously goes through the sieve. Black mass gets collected. You slap on the black mass into a drying process to remove moisture from it. Then you scrape it off of these meshes. You dump it into a giant bag, and you ideally then perform some sort of quality control to actually analyze whether it's potent enough to merit a fit for use for new batteries. Because just because you've acquired black mass doesn't mean that black mass powder is in and of itself already fit for use. There's a whole catalyzation process involved that will actually, just how you go about the process of forging some steel. There's, some of the metal that you lose during that process. Well, similarly, not only will you lose on a unit of weight black mass, but the potency and concentration very likely will be lost during that process as well. So it's important to monitor, how efficient you're able to catalyze the black mass that you've collected. and keep it so. So the problem now, if it's not already made very clear, is that there's a lot of steps that can go wrong, and the biggest need really is for quality control. Not only quality control while it's in process, but quality control after you have collected your black mass, and not only after you've collected it, but as it's sitting on your shelf, you have a race against time for things like moisture collecting in the black mass. You're never going to get a complete, 100% removal of moisture. There's always environmental variables as well on moisture collecting inside the black mass, which will ruin the quality, conductivity, as an example, the concentration of the precious metals obtained, as well as how much of one precious metal are you collecting versus another. And what that black mass can be used to repurpose for what specific kind of batteries, right? Because not all batteries are the same. Some batteries are good for some purposes, some are not. So it gets into a whole discussion about what purpose can this black mass actually be utilized for. And say you now have collected black mass. Are you sure that you've 100% sieved all of your sort of scrap material from it, right? Because that's equally important. How much of, say, a ratio of total raw material shredded to black mass collected are you actually able to run? And more importantly, how much of that black mass is usable, and for which sectors of battery use is it fit for? All of these things are very, very important. What I noticed is really here at Lifecycle, there was no real, number one, data sharing between battery recyclers. And there's no real consortium either for the sharing of not only process recipe data, but just general operations data on things like the series of form factors of batteries available, and for what industries those form factors are coming from, to then make a determination on, are we going to specialize in recycling for, I don't know, just throwing out a topic here, for batteries used from industrial scavengers because of the complexity of how most of those form factors of batteries come in, versus consumer electronics. The way the business was pitched was essentially, we can specialize in all batteries, and that it does not matter what type of batteries are going down the production line, which is 100% incorrect. It's just on its face, flat out incorrect. Not only that, but there was no real quality at all, quality control at all. Only recently did they start, and it was a manual sample inspection. And even there, it was a very rudimentary level of quality control, where essentially they were just tracking to see if any precious metals were present, period. It does not mean that there was a test done on the potency of those precious metals. It just detected whether they were there or not. Now, that completely defeats the purpose of generating black mass, because eventually somebody's quite literally going to be responsible for holding the bag. They're literally going to get, 1,000, 2,000 pound bag of black mass, and they're not going to have a single clue about whether it's usable or not. And if it's not, then they have to now do more work to make it usable. Ideally, especially as a raw material supplier, when we talk about chemistry, we have all sorts of checks and balances to verify the quality of the raw chemistry you're getting. We have C of A's, which are huge, and for all the chemists out there, how important those data sheets are, and it's a very easy way to essentially verify whether a supplier is being not only truthful, but if the raw material we just bought from them is usable at all. So it's one thing to find a customer that's going to use the black mass to be eventually repurposed as a battery, but it's another thing to just sell faulty black mass. that's not a good business model, period. Um, what I also saw a lot of was the conflation of total raw material shredded to not only black mass collected, but black mass collected that is fit for use, which again does not hold true or any weight because, no pun intended here, quality inspections were not a thing done consistently. And so they fundamentally had no data to do so. And I suspect pretty much every battery recycler is falling under this exact same issue. And that's primarily because most of these folks are running into the same issues that the so-called green legislation is coming into the assumption of, which is that there's a circular economy, everything's interoperable, and we can get data from anywhere. And it's not the case, unfortunately. So there's a conflation of weight, right? How much raw material, how much black mass are you getting from raw material? There's a complete lack of quality control. And there was just huge amounts of spending on technology systems that really, because number one, they were so early in the game, and number two, they still had very, very, very simple needs. They were just hemorrhaging money on solutions they did not exist, they did not need, and frankly, that need would not have existed for quite some time. And so, coupled with the fact that there were people chirping in their ears on not to go down this path, it's very clear that it's not just a matter of incompetence, but I would argue of negligence. Not only that, but there's a series of articles that clearly showed the past of the co-founders engaging in some less than pretty what sort of white collar collar crime behavior. So you couple that with, shoddy factory that was put together with no real data behind it and making all sorts of sustainability claims, coming back to greenwashing, coupled with many battery recycling companies sort of sprouting about in a very short period of time, coupled with the fact that there's so much complexity in this manufacturing process, even though their end product ultimately is simple, yet nobody in this space is really addressing any of that. Seems to me that this whole business of recycling batteries has turned into essentially a giant grift. And it's not to say that recycling batteries is not a noble or worthwhile approach or worthwhile initiative, but it's very clear that there's not a lot of truth and accountability and transparency going on for something that is going to impact so many people's lives. You would imagine there would be a much higher degree of transparency, but it's clear that there isn't. And one of the things that not just Li-Cycle, but other battery recyclers and even other manufacturers are still a victim of is a lot of the patent touting that's rife in manufacturing. A lot of companies still to this day advertise, we have 400 patents to our name. We have, 700 patents to our name. And it's a very bizarre flex to me because while I can appreciate the technological and scientific discovery, overall the patent intellectual property and patenting system is highly broken and highly just, it is not conducive to innovation. It is not conducive to the spread and sharing of ideas. It's actually very commonly and colloquially known as the sport of kings. And essentially it's used to throw your weight around legally into shoving would-be businesses aside into infinite litigation. And you make claims to technology regardless of whether it's actually accurate or not. Even if there's a slight similarity or semblance to yours, you throw them into patent litigation. And the last time I checked, which was about a year ago, the average length of a intellectual property patent dispute is about 19 months. So not only are you telling small businesses who are desperately trying to compete with other bigger businesses to go kick rocks, but you're telling them that we will put you in the court system and lock you up there as a way to shut you out of competing. So I leave all that present to you to really paint a bigger picture of what's at stake here, aside from just this one specific use case and scenario of battery recycling. There's other systemic issues at play that potentially are driving some of this behavior, but fundamentally, we cannot ignore the clear pattern of behavior of grifting, uh, of essentially, lying to the public. All right, some calls to action. So I am still working through essentially getting a list of the folks involved in the various initiatives I've mentioned, state agencies and state initiatives that are supposedly allocated for manufacturing to help build up digital infrastructure, and not only that, but to make it more open. If you're interested in helping, or you want to see how you might be able to get started in your area, feel free to DM me, and we'll work together. If you want to come on for a podcast together, I'd be more than happy to have you on. Feel free to reach out to me on any of my socials. And of course, if you have some content you want to get out there that you think people really need to see, especially if it has any information on open source and it's surrounding industrial automation, I'd love to share it, repost it, comment on it, or make a video on it potentially, and or write an article. There's more content I have surrounding the use case of life cycle in particular, and overall the battery recycling sector. And behind the scenes, I'm working on making some shorter content so that people are able to get a high level summary, get introduced to some of these topics, and potentially dive deeper if they're so inclined. But yeah, that's what I got going on. I did want to leave a link there for one of the many articles explaining some of the less than stellar background on the life cycle leadership, as well as some of the other behaviors they've engaged in. And again, I'll make this slide deck available for people at the end of the stream. But with that, let me go ahead and check to see if there's been any comments. So we'll go over here. All right. Okay. See on LinkedIn first. No. I don't see anything on LinkedIn, so I'll go on YouTube. All right, got some comments here. All right. Why do you keep on hanging to idea of open source? It seems that even in software industry doesn't translate to what's intended. There are multiple examples that switched to closed. That is true. Not to mention there's many examples where open source is a small component. Example, Fang, all have open source that are incredible, but they're tiny compared to what they overall do and fund. One could argue that there's no open source project without hidden motives, and in most instances just becomes a grift in itself through different side offerings. Yeah, look, I mean, as far as side offerings for open source projects, absolutely. I'm not saying that open source is without issues. It definitely has issues. So the grifting attempts through open source are definitely ever present. The advantage I am saying is inevitably these things will happen, right? Even in open source, inevitably corruption will happen. You can at least see it. and you can make a choice on whether you wish to build out functionality that is offered as a service for yourself, or if you are so emboldened to do the activism for rallying community to build out an open source framework to do, be it orchestration, to manage your infrastructure hosting of that open source platform. All I'm saying is, on that regard, open source allows you the option to do so. Closed source does not, period. And that I think we can both agree on. It is the ability to have a choice. It is not that it is perfect, but it is the ability to have a choice and control. So I do agree with you. There is definitely a lot of grifting in open source, but at least it's transparent and you can choose what to do about it. You do not have that choice in closed source. And that ability, that freedom to choose, I value over not having the option in the first place. As far as the other ones for projects that were open switching to closed, I think that definitely will happen in many cases. I'm not against, projects. I'm not against calling out projects that were open and turned to closed. If those reasons for being open first and going to close are transparent and are reasonable to the theme and the fit of the project, and if it truly makes sense, and if that's something the community at large has decided, I would see that as an acceptable practice. I don't agree with it, but I can understand. And at least that is a choice that, again, is able to be made. The fact that you cannot do that with closed source immediately turns me off to closed source, especially when we're talking about industrial automation. I could understand if it's a boutique video game company that is selling a video game. We are fundamentally talking about infrastructure that powers our phone lines, our houses, our vehicles. People's lives are an immediate risk, not only with physical catastrophes that potentially might occur, but more importantly, I think when these inevitable catastrophes do occur, none of us really have an understanding of just what happened to be able to audit that situation for ourselves. We would ultimately have to go through some sort of gatekeeper. And that level of censorship is just not something I can condone. And I would hope nobody today, or you, Twisted Cast, would also support. Just because there's somebody mentioned to me recently, what is it? The backdoor on Linux through the data compression library. Just because that backdoor occurred doesn't mean that Linux is trash now and we should abandon Linux. No, it's a good thing that it did occur, because we were able to show the world what it looks like to capture malicious intent in open source and the speed at which you can do it, versus how long would it have taken to encounter a similar issue on a closed source tool. And not only that, but the ramifications and how deep that rabbit hole goes would have been virtually impossible to detect in closed source until after all the damage has been done. So you consider what the 3 weeks it took to patch this versus what it would take for a closed source, and that's assuming that somebody even catches it in the first place. Is, again, the ability to have that control and the ability to have that freedom is paramount. And so I'm not saying open source is perfect in every way, shape, or form. Fundamentally, it offers transparency that closed source will never be able to offer. And so I cannot stand for anything in industrial automation that fundamentally is closed source, because nobody but a select few interest groups can verify and audit it. And when you have industrial power plants that are operating on closed source. And there's been many reports, by the way, if you take a look at research done on, the data brokers that companies like Rockwell and Siemens have essentially sold off to bad state actors to run malicious attacks on critical infrastructure or target specific manufacturers. Um, I'm not saying those data leaks and data brokers are going to cease to exist with open source, but we were able to see how deep that rabbit hole goes and audit the information for ourselves, right? We don't have to go through any sort of middleman. There is no gatekeeper. Everybody can see, and that's important, right? Again, we're talking about industrial automation here. We're not talking about video game development. We're not talking about a web developer. We're talking about industrial automation, powering people's lives. Industrial automation is essentially what makes the internet run. And if we cannot have transparency in how all that infrastructure is built and operated, then I think it's very clear that the default is, because it's not transparent and open, it must be under the control and domination of special few interest groups, and that's not acceptable. So I hope that answered your question. I think I saw something on LinkedIn. Come on, LinkedIn. Yes, there it is. Oh, look at that. It actually provided. Comment, let's see. Oh, all right. Any proposed solutions for a better lifecycle management approach? PLM, I think, is, if you're talking about PLM, like product lifecycle management, or if you're talking about general software lifecycle management. I'm not sure which of those two you're talking about, but for PLM, product lifecycle management, I think the types of features that proprietary tools like the SAP PLM module offer, I agree with the features. I just don't agree with the underlying technology being closed source. I think PLM is critical, and catastrophic incidences like the Baltimore bridge crash, essentially with the implementation of a PLM set of tools, would immutably show irrefutable evidence on the fact that it was what I'm purporting as clear leadership negligence of maintenance activities that ultimately led to the failure of the navigation system, that ultimately led to the crashing of the Singapore Maritime Group's ship on the Baltimore ship. And so there's many ways to do PLM. Overall, what matters is that you follow the software development lifecycle rather than a construction of a home, because as far as software systems go, you really don't know exactly how it's going to look like. So you cannot make a deterministic decision on it's going to look like this and it's going to have only these features. Regardless of which way you slice it, manufacturing / OT is really just software development. And so my suggestion is just stick to how software development is done when it comes to computer systems used for manufacturing. Oh, for better. Okay, so for better system on interoperability, product lifecycle management. Yeah, it's the same issues encountered by closed source systems are really no different than open source. What open source iteration and development allows you to do is you are able to share all of the social artifact correspondence, so you can see how it is that people are thinking about approaching the problem, and you can do that at scale. And you can also see the mechanisms that they are trying to carry out the work to essentially build the system. Versus when you utilize a closed source system, you have no real say in how that system gets developed. which features are prioritized. And so you do have that level of stakeholder weight when it comes to open source systems. And that in and of itself merits an entire video on how to efficiently do open source development. There's tons of other channels that I think have covered this to some extent. I'm blanking on some of their names right now, but I will make a note and get back to you on that. So let me go ahead and fire up my notes here. So I'll do just that. All right. Oh, my slide deck disappeared. There you go. System ability advice. Very good question. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. All right. See any on YouTube? Let's go back to LinkedIn. All right, cool. I don't see any other questions. Appreciate everybody that did pitch in a question. With that, I will end it at here. And yeah, slide deck available at the end of the presentation. So appreciate your time. Even though we might have disagreed, you chose to be here out of all the different places you could have been. And for that, I'm really grateful. I hope